What drives a teenager to turn against the world and kill 11 innocent people in just 8 days? Was it love or pure evil? You're watching Nightfall Crime Stories. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon, because tonight, we uncover one of America's darkest true stories, the chilling tale of Charles Starkweather and Caril Fugate. The last act of kindness. It was a freezing night on January 27, 1958, when 17-year-old Robert Jensen and his girlfriend, Carol King, were driving home from a date on a lonely Nebraska highway. In the distance, they spotted two figures walking, a young man with fiery red hair and a teenage girl beside him. They looked stranded, maybe in trouble. Being kind-hearted, Jensen slowed down and rolled down the window. "Car broke down?" he asked. The red-haired man nodded calmly. "Yeah, we could use a ride." Jensen smiled and unlocked the doors. "Hop in." It was the last act of kindness Robert Jensen would ever perform. Minutes later, the Good Samaritans found themselves staring down the barrel of a shotgun. They were forced to drive to an abandoned storm cellar, where their lives would end in unspeakable horror. The stranger's name was Charles Starkweather, and his companion, just 14 years old, was Caril Fugate. They had already murdered 6 people in the past week, including Caril's own family. The making of a killer. To understand what created Charles Starkweather, we need to go back to where it all began. Born on November 24, 1938, in Lincoln, Nebraska, Charles was the fourth of 7 children in a struggling working-class family. His father, Guy, was a carpenter who suffered from arthritis and couldn't always work. His mother, Helen, toiled endlessly as a waitress just to keep food on the table. Life was cruel to young Charles from the very beginning. He was born with genu varum, a condition that made his legs bow outward, giving him an awkward walk. He also had a noticeable lisp, and his speech was often mocked by classmates. "They made fun of everything about me," he would later recall. "The way I walked, the way I talked, everything. School became a daily nightmare." The only place he felt powerful was in gym class, where he discovered that his growing strength could be used for revenge. But it didn't stop at fighting bullies. Charles began targeting anyone who seemed better off, anyone who had what he didn't. His classmate, Bob Von Bush, later described him perfectly. "He could be the kindest person you'd ever meet. But he had another side, a cruel one. At home, things weren't much better. His father's temper often turned violent. Once, he pushed Charles so hard that he crashed through a window. Eventually, his parents divorced, and the fragile balance in Charles's life shattered completely. By high school, he was already known as a troublemaker, angry, bitter, and desperate for control. And then, he met Caril Fugate, a dangerous love story. It was 1956 when 18-year-old Charles met 13-year-old Caril outside her junior high school. He became obsessed instantly. Every day he waited outside her school like a predator watching his prey. He taught her to drive, took her on dates, and slowly cut her off from her family and friends. When Caril crashed his father's car during a lesson, Charles's father kicked him out of the house. He quit his warehouse job and became a garbage collector, a job that gave him time to stew in resentment toward the world. He developed a twisted personal philosophy. "If the world treats me like garbage, I'll act like it. Dead people are all on the same level." This wasn't teenage rebellion. It was the birth of a killer's mindset. And when Charles wanted to prove his power to the world, Caril was right there beside him. The first kill on November 30th, 1957. Charles walked into Crest Service Station in Lincoln, Nebraska. He saw a stuffed toy, something he wanted to buy for Caril. But when the attendant, 21-year-old Robert Culvert, refused to let him buy it on credit, Charles felt humiliated. That night, he returned with a shotgun. "Give me the money," he demanded. Culvert handed over about $100, but Charles wanted more. He forced the young man into a car, drove him to a remote area, and executed him with multiple shots to the head. It was no accident, no self-defense. It was cold-blooded murder, and Charles loved the feeling. He had crossed a line and found power in death. The Bartlett murders, 2 months later. On January 21st, 1958, Charles went to Caril's house. Her parents had already told him to stay away. When her mother, Marion Bartlett, told him to leave, Charles pulled out a gun and shot her dead. Then he killed Caril's stepfather, Velda, and beat their 2-year-old daughter, Betty Jean, to death. He hid the bodies in an outhouse and chicken coop, and then waited for Caril to come home. What happened next remains one of America's most debated mysteries. Charles claimed that Caril knew what he'd done and agreed to help him. Caril said he told her her family was being held hostage, and that if she cooperated, they would be safe. Whichever version is true, the result was the same. For 6 days, the 2 teenagers stayed in that blood-soaked house, watching TV, eating dinner, and pretending everything was fine, while 3 bodies decomposed just outside the door. When relatives called, Caril told them, "Everyone's sick with the flu." By the time police finally arrived, Charles and Caril were gone. The killing spree begins. Next stop was the home of 70-year-old August Meyer, a family friend who welcomed Charles inside without suspicion. Charles shot him in the head. Then, for no reason at all, he killed Meyer's dog. After stealing his car, they got stuck in the mud, stranded in the countryside. That's when fate delivered them their next victims, 17-year-old Robert Jensen and 16-year-old Carol King. The couple had stopped to help and paid the ultimate price. Charles shot Jensen in the head, then brutally killed King after she fought back. From there, the pair drove to Lincoln, not to hide but to kill again. Murder in the mansion. The next victims were Chester and Clara Ward, a wealthy couple who lived in the kind of house Charles had always envied. First, Charles murdered their maid, Lillian Fensel, stabbing her to death. Then he killed the family dog to silence it. When Clara returned home, Charles stabbed her repeatedly. Hours later, when Chester walked through the door, he shot him dead. They stayed in the luxurious home, eating the family's food and clipping newspaper articles about themselves, trophies of their growing infamy. But this murder changed everything. It wasn't just another crime anymore. The rich and powerful were now terrified. The governor called in the National Guard. Nebraska was in panic. The final stop on January 29, 1958. 8 days into their killing spree, Charles and Caril crossed into Wyoming. They needed a new car. So when they found 34-year-old traveling salesman Merle Collison asleep in his vehicle, Charles shot him point blank. But when he tried to drive away, he couldn't figure out the parking brake. Frustrated, he got out, just as geologist Joe Sprinkle stopped to help. At that exact moment, Deputy William Romer pulled up behind them. Seeing her chance, Caril ran toward the officer screaming, "It's Starkweather! He's going to kill me!" Charles jumped into Collison's car and sped off. But after a high-speed chase, he surrendered when shattered glass from a police bullet cut his face. He thought he was bleeding to death. That's why he gave up. Just like that, the 8-day reign of terror was over. The trials in custody. Charles first claimed that Caril was innocent, a hostage forced to come along. But when he realized she was blaming him entirely, his story changed. He told the court that Caril was the most trigger-happy person I ever met. Caril, meanwhile, stuck to her version, that she was a terrified child manipulated by a killer. The evidence told a more complicated story. She had answered calls, lied to relatives, and stayed with Charles long after she could have escaped. In May 1958, Charles was tried for just one murder, Robert Jensen's, because that was enough to secure a death sentence. He showed no remorse, no guilt, just arrogance. After 22 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty. Judge Harry Spencer sentenced him to death. Caril's trial was next. Her defense argued she was too young to understand what was happening. The prosecution saw her as a willing partner. She was sentenced to life in prison, just 17 years old. The execution. Charles spent a year on death row, calm, unbothered, even writing to his parents, "I'm not real sorry for what I did, 'cause for the first time, me and Caril had fun." On June 25, 1959, Charles Starkweather was executed in the electric chair. He was only 20 years old, ironically. The doctor assigned to confirm his death suffered a fatal heart attack 30 minutes before the execution. Charles showed no emotion, no fear, just the cold emptiness that had defined his short, violent life. Aftermath of a nightmare, Caril Fugate spent the next 17 years behind bars. She earned her diploma, stayed out of trouble, and eventually gained parole in 1976 at age 32. She moved to Michigan, trying to build a quiet life away from her infamous past. In rare interviews, she's always maintained her innocence, saying she was a scared girl manipulated by an older, violent man. But the question remains, was she truly a victim? Or was she a willing accomplice in one of America's bloodiest teenage crime sprees? Legacy of Fear the Victims. Robert Colvert, the Bartlett family, August Meyer, Robert Jensen, Carol King, Lillian Fensel, the Wards, and Merle Collison were ordinary people living ordinary lives. They never deserved to become headlines or case studies in evil. Their tragedy reminds us that behind every true crime story, there are real lives, real families, and real pain. Charles Starkweather's case forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about how violence breeds, how love can twist into horror, and how society sometimes creates the monsters it fears most. So what do you think? Was Caril Fugate an innocent 14-year-old brainwashed by a murderer? Or was she part of his killing spree from the very beginning? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them. If you found this story chilling, make sure to subscribe to Nightfall Crime Stories and hit the bell icon so you never miss the real stories behind the world's darkest crimes. Because when night falls, the truth comes out.